Hey everybody, welcome to the very first video of a whole series that I'm going to make that's going to be based on teaching people how to do wildlife photography. Now, this entire series is going to cover a ton of stuff, not just settings. Obviously, this episode is completely dedicated to the basics of photography for beginners, but throughout all of my videos and all the series, we're going to talk about settings, techniques, what I carry, what lenses I use. I'm going to do like a whole lens buying guide, a whole camera buying guide, and tons of other stuff. And I'm also super open to questions or ideas that you guys might have on things that you want me to cover. For those of you who haven't seen any of my previous videos, my name is Josh. I've been a full-time professional photographer for over 6 years. My wife and I actually own a wedding photography company that we do together, and I obviously also do all of this wildlife. Now, I want to just jump straight into this video and talk about what we're going to learn today, and that is the basics of exposure using a camera. We're going to talk about shutter speed, we're going to talk about ISO, and we're going to talk about aperture. Now, those three things are what you would call an exposure triangle, and all three of them would work together to create what you would call like your perfect exposure. Now, the beginning of this is going to be all about terminology and definitions, and we're going to go over what each one means and what they do and everything like that. But towards the end of the video, I'm going to talk about how you apply it to the field, how you determine how to make an exposure, what settings to use, and everything like that. Now, a few disclaimers just before we start. Every single thing that you're going to learn about has 100% to do with light. All of it's going to tell you is how much available light you have for the camera to see it and how to take a photo in that. And then second, none of this is 100% dependent only on wildlife photography. Everything that you are going to learn in this video, you can apply to any sort of photography that you want. This is the complete basics. Every single camera that you buy, everything between a camera, a cell phone, a Ring doorbell, all of it uses these three things to create their exposure. So you can apply this any way that you want. Now let's start with the easiest one to understand, and that's actually going to be shutter speed. I'm not going to get super technical in here and describe to you exactly how cameras work, because you honestly don't need to know that right now. That is really, really far down the line, and you don't need to understand that. For now, all you need to know is shutter speed is how long the camera allows the light to touch the sensor. Now, generally for most cameras, the longest you can have your shutter open will be 30 seconds, and then the fastest generally is 1/8,000th of a second. Now, obviously, the longer the shutter is open, the more light comes in, and obviously the shorter, the less. Now, the one real takeaway from shutter speed is the longer the shutter is open, the more blur you can get in your image. All right, so when I say blur, this is what I mean. Now, here's some motion at 1/8,000th of a second. I had this cute little alligator swinging around on a rope, and don't worry, the rope is actually under his arms. But I dropped him from about shoulder height so he could swing in front of the camera, and I took some photos. Now, at 1/8,000th, you can tell that is super crispy. You can tell that the shutter speed really locked in all of the motion, and as we get into the 1/4000th, along with the 1/2000th, it all generally kind of looks alike. They all look really crispy, and that's because anything faster than about 1/2000th was going to lock in any of the motion anyway. And as we get into the 1/800th, you will notice that it is slightly blurry, and we're getting into a slightly too slow of shutter speed. Now, it's not enough to really freeze the frame. And then obviously, as we get slower into the 1/200th, the 1/100th, and so on, it just gets progressively worse and worse. And by 4 seconds, obviously, you can't even tell what is swinging in front of you, if there is anything. Now, a good rule of thumb on where to start with setting your shutter speed is that it should generally be 2 times your focal length. So my lens is a 400mm. That means I should be at 1/800th of a second as my absolute minimum. Now, again, these are all rules to be broken. I don't always abide by that. If I'm on a tripod or something like that, I will dip it a little bit lower. But if you're handheld, if you're moving, if you're taking photos of something moving, generally that 2 times is a really good place to start. Obviously, ideally, you would want something a little bit faster to really make sure that you lock it in, but that's only if you have really good light. Now that you've seen kind of how shutter speed affects your image, we're going to talk about the next thing, which is actually aperture. And aperture is similar to shutter speed because what it does is it controls the amount of light that gets to the sensor, but instead of using the camera itself, it actually uses the lens. Now, unlike shutter speed, where all of the control on how much light comes into the sensor is controlled by the camera, your aperture, all of that is controlled by the lens itself, and all your camera does is communicate to the lens to tell it what to do. Now, inside the lens, there is what you would call an iris or your aperture, and it's just a ring that gets smaller or bigger as you change your number. The smaller the number, the more wide open the ring gets, and then as you change it to something larger, let's say you go from 2.8 to 5.6, what it does is it actually makes the hole smaller and smaller as it goes. Now, the hardest part to understand about your aperture is that as you change your number and the iris or aperture gets smaller or bigger, that also has a secondary effect, which is called depth of field. So when I say depth of field, what I mean is how much distance your subject is actually in focus, and then how much blur there is in the image. So if you're using your lens and you're at the maximum aperture, which is also the smallest the number will get, that is actually your most shallow depth of field, which means you have the most amount of blur. As you bring your aperture up and make the lens aperture iris slightly smaller, that actually increases your depth of field, reducing the amount of blur. Now, I know this is probably really confusing, but let's go talk about what that means. You can see that the maximum aperture of my lens is 2.8, and that is going to give me the most shallow depth of field that my lens can produce. As we bring the aperture up and make the iris smaller, the depth of field gets deeper, allowing more of the scene to come into focus and making the background less blurry. You can definitely see that in the blades of grass as they get more in focus as I bring my aperture up. Now, one thing that really gets people hung up is that how do you figure out what your depth of field really is? And I'm going to be honest with you, it's really hard. It's actually a mathematical equation between the length of your lens, your aperture, and then the distance your subject is from your lens. Now let's talk about the final and simplest setting, which is ISO, but it is also the hardest to understand. Now, you don't need to know what ISO means. It's actually a holdover from the film days when you had your film speed of like 100, 400, 800, everything like that. When they went to digital, they just kept that name and put it in there. And all it really means is that as you bring your ISO up, let's say from a base 100, which is most cameras, all the way up to, let's say, 6,400, 10,000, etc., all that it means is that you're making your sensor more sensitive. Now, when I say more sensitive, all that I mean is that the light that's coming in through your camera from the aperture through the shutter speed and onto the sensor itself is being taken advantage of more with a higher number. Now, it's very confusing at first, and I promise you'll understand once we're done, but all it means is that the lower the number, the less sensitive, and the higher the number, the more sensitive. Now, just like every other setting on your camera, there's a secondary effect of changing your ISO. And what that means is when you're at the base 100, which is most cameras, that would be the cleanest the image is, which means it is the least amount of noise. As you change your ISO and bring it up, you slightly have more grain every single time you go up. Now, each camera is unfortunately different in how it handles all of that. So you'll have to go into your camera itself and kind of test it out and see what you like. But as you get into the higher numbers, it becomes more grainy or more noise in the image. Now, when I say noise, I do not mean something that you can hear. That is just grain or pixelation inside the image. Now, here's a full set of photos of ISO starting from 100. In 100, you will notice that it is a very clean image with almost no noise or grain whatsoever, and it actually stays very similar throughout until you get to about 6,400. You will see the grain over the alligator's shoulder, but I'm still retaining fine detail in the nose. But after that, it drops off significantly, and at 12,800, I am getting very noticeable grain, along with starting to lose fine details until we get to the top end of 51,200, and it's essentially a mosaic painting. Now, like I said before, each camera is completely different. Not all of them are going to be the same, and you should go out in the field and test where your limit on ISO is going to be. Your camera is going to be able to take images way higher than you're going to be really comfortable taking that image at, just because it's going to be so noisy and have so much grain. But it's really important to know where your ceiling is on where you're comfortable. That way, when you're out in the field and the light is getting dim and you're bringing your ISO up, you'll know exactly where you want to be. And if you need to, you'll bring your shutter speed down or something like that. But we'll get to that a little bit later. Now, your head is probably spinning and you're just saying, great, I have all of this information now, but I still don't understand how I'm going to use it in the field. And I promise to you, in a few minutes, all of it will make total sense. Now that you know what shutter speed, ISO, and aperture all do to your image and what effects or side effects that it can have, it's time to put it all together and create your exposure. Now, something that a lot of people don't understand is that all of your settings have to be in harmony. There's no perfect my outside settings. You can't just go outside and be like, my aperture is going to be 5.6. My ISO is going to be 100. My shutter speed is going to be 1000. That's my outside settings. That's not how it goes. It is all dependent on the available light that you have at the time. Now, the way I like to think about exposure or your exposure triangle is an old-timey courthouse scale where it has the two trays and the lady holding it. But instead of two trays, it has three. So when you're setting your ISO, your aperture, and your shutter speed, one of them can't be heavier than the other. All of them need to be in perfect balance that creates a perfect exposure. Okay, let's jump right into it and go over how to set a perfect exposure. First, we're going to have to go over a few things you'll see on your camera. Now, where they are is dependent on which camera you have, but generally you will have an exposure meter right here along with a histogram. Now, the histogram won't be turned on by default, but I like to turn it on. The exposure meter is going to tell you if things are exposed properly or are underexposed. If the line is to the right of the center, you are overexposed, and if it's to the left, you are underexposed. The histogram does roughly the same thing, but shows you your actual levels. So it shows this little mountain that moves around based on your exposure. And what it does is show you the actual darks and lights that you have in the image. Just like the exposure meter, the histogram will have the lights to the right hand side and the darks to the left. Okay, now let's expose for the first time. You can see that my image is very dark. Now, I go in 3 steps. The first one is my aperture. I'm going to be honest with you, I am a glutton for a blurry background, so about 99% of the time I am wide open or the widest my aperture will go. So let's set my aperture to 2.8. Next is shutter speed. I see that I'm already at 1/1000th, which is, I know, roughly the slowest I'd want to be, but I could go down some. But since that my ISO is at 100, I know that I have a lot of wiggle room there before I really see any noise. So I set my ISO to 500. That brings my exposure meter to the perfect center and brings my histogram roughly to the middle. Let's do another one. This time, instead of being too dark, I know it's too bright. I see my aperture is exactly where I want it to be at 2.8, but I also see that my shutter speed is a little bit too slow. My ISO is probably way too high for during the day though. So first, I bring my shutter speed to the minimum I want it to be, which is 1/800th. Then I bring my ISO down to 400. I see that I have a little wiggle room with the ISO, and I know that the grain or noise between ISO 400 and 800 is essentially the same, so I bring my ISO up to 800, and then I also bring my shutter speed to 1600th of a second to make my perfect exposure. And that's what I mean by saying that they all need to balance. I can't change one without needing to change the other to maintain the same exposure. Let's do one last one when it has to do with exposure. This time, let's throw in some depth of field issues. So instead of having a single subject in frame, I now have 2, and I want them both in focus. You can see that my gluttony of blurry backgrounds has betrayed me, and the 2.8 aperture is just too shallow to get the little cow in focus too. This time I'm going to change my aperture slowly until I get both of them in focus. I'm going to be trying to balance my exposure as I go also. I slowly bring up my aperture and my ISO until I get to f11 and ISO 6400. Now I know that 6400 is probably the highest I'll comfortably go, and that I already am at the lowest shutter speed I'm comfortable with, but I see that the little cow just isn't sharp enough yet. I bring my aperture to f16, which gets my little cow in focus, and my ISO to 12,800. That is obviously far higher than I am comfortable with. But generally, I would rather try and fix the ISO issue later than try and fix a blurry image from not having a fast enough shutter speed. Now, obviously, I shoot in full manual. I think it's the best way to learn and to get really comfortable with your camera and you understand what everything does. But I promise you that is not the only way. There are other options, and those would be time value and aperture value. Now with time value, all that means is you're setting your shutter speed to exactly what you want it to be. So you pick up your camera, your shutter speed is 160th of a second, which you know is too slow for you, and then you go take an image. You set your shutter speed to what you want it to be at 640th of a second, but your aperture is telling you that you're underexposed at 2.8. So you bring it up to 400 and you're perfectly exposed. But you decide that for some reason you want to be at ISO 500. Now that you're in time value and ISO 500, the only way for your camera to compensate and balance your exposure is by bringing up your aperture. As you bring up your ISO more, your aperture will also increase to balance everything out. And then it's the same thing for aperture value, where you set your aperture. So let's say you know you want your aperture to be 2.8. Then the camera is going to just decide what the other one should be. So it'll set the ISO and it'll set the shutter speed. Now there is a fourth option, and that's actually in manual, and you can set it to auto ISO. Now, not every single camera is going to be capable of this, but most modern ones will. And as you know, the way that I set it is I set my shutter speed, I set my aperture, and then I kind of just set my ISO to whatever it kind of needs to be within reason. And instead of me doing that, the camera does it. So it knows that I set my shutter speed, I set my aperture, and then it just decides whatever ISO that it needs to be. It could save me some time. I don't use it a lot because I am just in the habit of doing it myself anyways, but it is an option, and it is a really good option. Now, there are a few times that you can't fully trust your exposure meter, which is why I almost always shoot in full manual. In this instance, I have a very bright subject with a very dark background. Technically, my camera is telling me that this is the perfect exposure, and my exposure meter is directly in the middle, and my histogram is generally okay. But you can tell that the cow is completely overexposed and blown out, and that's because the camera only sees light and not the photo itself. It sees all the black in the background, and it thinks that it needs to be brighter than it should be. You can see I bring my ISO down to 640. This is how I believe the image should be taken because I know that my whites won't be blown out or overexposed. Technically, the camera says I am underexposed by almost 2 full stops, but I think that this is correct. Now here's the same idea but opposite. I have a dark subject and a very bright background. My camera again says that this is the correct exposure, but I believe that my subject is way too dark. The camera is seeing all of the white snow, which is tricking the exposure meter. I bring my ISO up to 500, which brightens the image and properly exposes my subject. But again, my exposure meter is telling me that I am overexposed by almost 2 full stops. The real takeaway from this is that you can use some sort of automatic setting, but when you are in an environment that you might have these scenarios, it is important to know how to expose manually. I just want you to get out of using any of the fully automatic settings like the little green box or the guy running or the mountain or anything like that. The more you understand how your camera works, the more you're going to get out of it. The little green box has absolutely no idea what you're taking a photo of. It does not know what its shutter speed should be for that subject. It doesn't know anything about the image. It just knows that I have this much light and I'm going to make an image from that. And the same goes for the sport setting. All it does is prioritize a slightly faster shutter speed, but it has no idea. It might not be enough if you're taking photos of something moving really fast, like a bird in flight. And then the same goes for a landscape, which is the little mountain setting on most cameras. All that is going to do is say that I need a much deeper depth of field, so I'm going to prioritize the aperture. All of these things limit your creativity, and it really holds you back of taking the images that you really want to take. You guys, you made it to the end. Thank you so much. I really hope that was educational. I hope you learned something. Now, the next few videos are all going to be building on what you learned today, and it's going to be more advanced techniques. It's going to be more settings, how to get the maximum quality out of your camera. If you like this video and you want to see more, please like and subscribe. Again, every YouTuber, but it does help. I want to thank you guys so much for watching this, and I will see you next time.